Welcome to this dialogue of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life on President Biden, the U.S. Catholic bishops, and Pope Francis. Before we turn to the conversation, I want to share some good news with you. My name is John Carr, and I'm the founder of the initiative. And the good news is that Kim Daniels is joining me as co-director of the initiative. She's been deeply involved in our work since the beginning. She was part of our first dialogue on the Francis Factor 7 years ago. She was one of the first people in our dialogues with young leaders in Washington. She co-chaired with me our national leadership convening on overcoming polarization. That really worked out well. There's no polarization anymore. We handle that. And over the last 2 years, she has been associate director of the initiative. And now she has accepted my invitation and President DeGioia's invitation to join me as co-director of the initiative. Kim and I come from different generations. We come from different parts of our family of faith. We share a deep commitment to Catholic social teaching, to the leadership of Pope Francis, and to the Catholic mission and Jesuit identity of Georgetown University. She brings terrific education, degrees from Princeton and University of Chicago Law School, extraordinary knowledge, connections to the Church in the U.S. and the Vatican, and all sorts of skills that have been advancing our work. So I'm delighted that Kim and I, with our invaluable partner, Anna Misla, will lead this initiative together for the next month and years, and I'm happy to share that news with you. We think our mission of promoting dialogue, encouraging young leaders, sharing the social teaching of the Church is more important than ever at a time of divisions in our country, in our Church, in Washington. So with that, I'm happy to turn over this dialogue to the moderator, the new co-director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life, Kim Daniels.
Thanks so much, John. It's an honor to work with you, and I'm really excited for this next chapter of the initiative's life as you and I continue to work with Anna to advance the principles of Catholic social thought and Pope Francis's leadership at this challenging time for our Church and nation. There's tremendous interest in the discussion we have here today. We have some 4,000 RSVPs from around the country and the world. Many of you have already sent us questions, and we invite you, others of you, to do so as well by sending them to the email that you see at the bottom of your screen. And please also share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag Biden Bishops Francis and by tagging the initiative at GUCST Public Life on Twitter. So anyone watching President Joe Biden's inauguration couldn't miss the fact that our new president is Catholic. He's a mass attending, rosary saying, on eagle's wings singing Catholic whose faith is deep and strong and has carried him through suffering and through his success. And he has a faith very much like that of millions of other American Catholics. The inauguration was filled with signs of faith. This wasn't a naked public square. President Biden's first act as president, in fact, was a moment of prayer for the 400,000 Americans lost to the pandemic this past year. He began Inauguration Day with Mass at St. Matthew's with family, leaders of the new administration, and the bipartisan leadership of Congress. The inauguration itself included prayers from his friend, the past president of Georgetown University, as well as a quote from St. Augustine, Latina Catholics representing a remarkable young Black Catholic poet, and the language of dignity and justice and unity. And a lot has happened in the first week. A proposed new COVID relief plan, executive orders on racial justice, environmental justice, economic justice, and many others. And yet for me and many others, there was something crucial missing. Steps to increase protection for the most vulnerable among us did not include protection for the unborn child. In fact, the new president and administration acted and promised to act to end longstanding protections for unborn children in our country and around the world, and to expand the grave injustice of abortion. Of course, we can't talk about all this in the abstract. We have to put it in our broader current context. We're a year into a deadly and deadening pandemic that has laid bare any number of other underlying crises, including an economy that leaves far too many behind, a national reckoning on racism in our streets and structures and in our own hearts and our community of faith. And we're still in the middle of another crisis that's unprecedented in recent history. On the day of President Biden's inauguration, the Capitol grounds were surrounded and protected by military forces for a reason. Just 2 weeks before, a violent mob had stormed the Capitol, threatening to kill lawmakers, killing a law enforcement official, causing the deaths of others, and wounding many, many more. A riot incited by former President Trump in an attempt to overturn the results of the election. So in this particular moment, how can Catholic leaders act with wisdom and integrity so as to best engage with the new administration and most effectively advance the common good? We've seen a number of differing examples. Pope Francis sent a general congratulatory message offering his blessings and calling for unfailing respect for the rights and dignity of every person, especially the poor, the vulnerable, and those who have no voice. Archbishop Jose Gomez, the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, released a lengthy statement saying that it would be refreshing to engage with a president who clearly understands the importance of religious faith and institutions, but also warning that Biden has pledged to pursue certain policies that would advance moral evils and threaten human life and dignity. And of course, many other bishops and cardinals have weighed in. There's been a lot of commentary and criticism, division and disarray, divisions between the U.S. bishops and Pope Francis, as well as among the U.S. bishops. So the question on the table for us today is how Catholic leaders can best bring Catholic social principles to public life in our current context, and how should they engage with a Catholic president with Biden's faith, history, and policy commitments. Today, we've brought together a great group to discuss this. Leaders of pro-life and social justice communities in the church, a key Catholic bishop, and a respected journalist covering Pope Francis to help us answer this question, assess the situation, and offer different perspectives and possible ways forward for President Biden, the U.S. bishops, and Pope Francis and U.S. Catholics. Joining us are Helen Alvarez, a professor at the Scalia Law School of George Mason University, a member of the Vatican Dicastery for Laity, Family, and Life, an advisor to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, where she served as the longtime leader of the USCCB's pro-life policy, advocacy, and communications efforts. John Carr, my colleague and partner, the founder and co-director of the initiative. John served for more than 2 decades as director of the Office of Justice, Peace, and Human Development for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and of course founded and leads the initiative. Bishop Robert McElroy, the Bishop of San Diego, California, who is a graduate of Harvard and Stanford. Bishop McElroy is the author of The Search for an American Public Theology, the contribution of John Courtney Murray. And finally, Ann Thompson, who has reported for NBC News for more than 2 decades, covering the Catholic Church for most of that time. Ann's traveled on the papal plane with Pope Francis to Rio de Janeiro, South Korea, Africa, Mexico, Cuba, and the United States. She's a graduate of Notre Dame and a practicing Catholic who belongs to a parish in New York City. So to get us started, I'm going to ask the entire panel to briefly offer an assessment of where we are, and then come back to each of them with more specific questions based on their experience. We'll have some discussion among the panelists after that, and then I'll ask them to respond to questions from the audience. So let's get the conversation started. Ann, in the words of the title of this dialogue, help us understand what's going on in the relationship between President Biden, the U.S. bishops, and Pope Francis. What was that all about? And what does it signal for the Catholic Church's engagement with the second Catholic president?
First of all, congratulations, Kim, on being named co-director. The work that you do at Georgetown is truly extraordinary. And having the opportunity to talk to each other, I think, is so important. And that may be what's missing here in the relationship between the Pope, the President, and the U.S. Catholic bishops. I think if you look at it, you see much more opportunity for a dialogue between Pope Francis and President Biden. If you look at their issues, what do they have in common? That's how Pope Francis approaches leaders. What do they have in common? You're talking about trying to end climate change. They both are very concerned with the refugee crisis, with immigration reform, with racial injustice and environmental justice. And I think those are the common grounds. And we all focus, especially in the media, we focus on the division over abortion, and in missing where they have common ground, you miss the opportunities. And I think back to 2015 when then President Obama met with Pope Francis in at the Vatican in March, and fast forward 9 months later, and all of a sudden there is a détente, if you will, between the US and Cuba that was brokered in part by Pope Francis. And we missed that because we were focused. I remember sitting there doing the play-by-play of that meeting in March 2015, and we're all focused on the contraception mandate of the Affordable Care Act, and not looking at other issues where the two have things in common.
Thanks for that, Anne. John, let's turn to you. What's your reaction? What do you think we can take from everything that happened last week, and how can we best engage with the new Biden administration as Catholic leaders?
Well, I don't think we're where we want to be. On inauguration morning, I was watching the cable networks talk about why President Biden had invited the congressional leadership to St. Matthew's for Mass instead of across the street from the White House for a generic prayer service. And I was feeling pretty good about that moment. And then over my iPad came a thing that Archbishop Gomez, on behalf of the USCCB, as you explained, had released a long statement which acknowledged Biden's faith, but also challenged him for commitment to moral evils of contraception, abortion, gender, and marriage. And then, something came in saying it had been spiked by the Vatican and anonymous quotes and who had done it. And then at noon, it was unspiked, and there was a very different statement from Pope Francis. And then we had all the back and forth, anonymous quotes, statements from cardinals. Bishop McElroy made a good statement. At the very moment where we should be coming together to make our case for human life and dignity, we were showcasing our divisions. And Helen and I have worked at the conference. I have enormous sympathy for Archbishop Gomez trying to craft something that would hold the conference together. But it seems to me that we have to find a way to focus on how we can work together to advance values we share and to contain some of the differences over priorities and approaches. The bishop's statement on faithful citizenship in past years has put it this way: we need to be political but not partisan. We should not be cheerleader or chaplain to any party or candidate, apologist for any administration, nor should we be an adversary or a part of the resistance or the opposition. We ought to be principled but not ideological. We ought to be willing to work with people where we find common ground, even though we acknowledge our differences. We ought to be civil but not silent. We can't fail to acknowledge differences with the president, but we should also acknowledge where we have common ground. And we need to be engaged but not used by either side. It seems to me we have unique assets, a set of ideas, a set of experience, presence all across the country, around the world. Many people, many Catholics and leaders like Archbishop Gomez, like Cardinal Cupich, like Bishop McElroy, like Pope Francis. A friend of mine said, if you ever got your act together, you'd be dangerous. My fear is we don't have our act together.
Thanks for that, John. Helen, let's turn to you. What's your reaction to what Anne and John have said, and what did you take away from last week? What do you think is the best step forward for how bishops, the other Catholic leaders can engage with the Biden administration?
You know, I have a relatively low drama reaction to it. The first, I think there's two parts to the Catholic bishops, the U.S. Church's reaction. One is the usual, the way we deal with all politicians, which is, thank you for this, please don't do that. Really, really, please don't do that. Thank you for this. And, you know, the Catholic bishops are sophisticated adults. A lot of Catholics are used to dealing with politicians at this level. I'll never forget Cardinal O'Connor dealing with Mayor Ed Koch saying, hey, you know, if you're going to force me to put contraception in all of our social services, I'm going to close them on Monday. Oh, gee, that's tomorrow. Sorry, Ed. And he's the same guy who, I was at the memorial service and Ed Koch and I both spoke, who told me that Cardinal O'Connor was his dearest friend, one of his greatest allies in the fight against AIDS at that time. We're big boys and girls. We can have disagreements. I remember once absolutely beating Nita Lowey on a factual argument on the NewsHour, and we were laughing about it the next day when I was lobbying her. She said, "You ate my lunch. You did a great job," and we're laughing. So that's the usual. The other part of it is unusual. It's the interaction with the president who declares himself guided by Catholic faith. So here, number one, I think Catholics want to know that his local bishop really will interact with them. We say that he should. Tell us you're doing it. And tell us that you're having that pastoral interaction. Second, if, Biden or anyone in his administration starts making misstated, claims about the faith, statements about what conscience requires, or claiming that if he reimposes the contraception mandate, it's not a burden on the little sisters, then he has to be theologically corrected and saying, please don't do theology incorrectly. And then I think the third and final is that a Biden administration is going to say and is already saying that their positions on abortion, gender, marriage, et cetera, are all about freedom and love and compassion. And, as a church of reason and faith, we're going to owe it to our people to be even more clear than usual to say our teachings are exactly what is required to promote actual freedom, actual love, actual compassion. Sex with no reference to tomorrow is not loving. Denying God's reality about how we live and love is not loving. It's not compassionate. We can't just state the rule. We're going to have to be very explicatory in the future. So that's my thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. That's great. Let's go to you, Bishop McElroy. What's your reaction to what everybody said so far? What's your reaction to what happened last week and the future for engagement between the Biden administration and the U.S. bishops?
Well, I think it's important to start out with what are the realities we faced in trying to get to a common ground and strategies for unity and peaceful cooperation. We have a Catholic president who's committed to fighting racism, supporting immigrants, and protecting our planet, yet who consistently rejects the profound moral imperative to enact legal sanctions on the grave evil of abortion. We have a Conference of Bishops who, as Helen explained, throughout its 50-year history, has understood itself to have the specific religious and moral mission in the political order to form consciences, contribute to the public debate, and advocate for key public policy issues. In approaching public officials and administrations in pursuit of this mission, as John pointed out, the conference has historically adopted a stance of engagement, dialogue, and critique. At this moment, though, I believe, in contrast with what Helen was pointing out, some bishops want to recast the presence and tone of the conference in the public order. They argue that abortion is not merely a preeminent issue in Catholic social teaching, but rather constitutes the de facto litmus test for determining whether a Catholic public official is a faithful Catholic and for determining whether the overall policy stances of non-Catholic officials can be considered morally legitimate. If adopted, such a position will reduce the common good to a single issue. Those proposing this approach in the conference assert that given the centrality of abortion, the conference must adopt an overall stance of confrontation with the president and his administration. There can be cooperation on many issues, but only within a fundamental ethos of opposition. Furthermore, many bishops are proposing that the conference take steps to publicly deprive President Biden of his ability to receive the Eucharist. In contrast to the direction advocated by this bloc of bishops, we have a pope who has placed encounter, dialogue, honesty, and collaboration at the heart of his approach to public conversation, and who is unlikely to endorse the deprivation of the Eucharist from the president. And finally, and I think most importantly, we have a Catholic community and a nation in need of unity and healing, and that should be the focus of our way forward, I think.
Thanks for that, Bishop McElroy, and thanks to all of you. I think we had a number of different perspectives there. And now I want to go a little deeper into that conversation. And Bishop McElroy, you mentioned Pope Francis, and I want to turn to you about that. You cover the Catholic Church for NBC News. You've covered Pope Francis for many, many years. You've flown on the plane with him. You've spent a lot of time at the Vatican. Last week, you and your team put together a great report on what's going on between the Biden administration, the Vatican, and the bishops, and tensions in the Catholic Church. What's your take on the relationship between Pope Francis and the Biden administration in particular, and how that plays out with the U.S. bishops, and also maybe what this will mean for policy initiatives on issues like abortion, like the environment, like racism?
I think, Kim, what I was struck by is that throughout his pontificate, Pope Francis does not want to get involved in the local political issues of any country. That is not what he's about. And whenever he travels the world, somebody's always trying to reel him into that. We saw that in the US when he visited in 2015, and Kim Davis, who is the county clerk from Kentucky, had a brief meeting with the Pope, and it was blown up to be a 30-minute private audience, and then it was pulled back, and the Vatican put out 2 press releases saying it was nothing more than a quick meet and greet. And then finally, the Pope released the video of him meeting with his former student, who is a gay man, and his partner. And so you see that pushback. And I think you saw that pushback on Saturday when Pope Francis very publicly said he met with Cardinal Cupich after Cardinal Cupich opposed Archbishop Gomez's letter on the day of Biden's his inauguration. So I think what you can expect is, look, this Pope wants to work with this administration in areas where they have common ground. And then maybe that is by establishing that you can work in other areas where you don't have common ground.
Well, I think that sounds like the approach we've heard from several people here. And at the same time, I wonder if you might talk a little bit in more detail about how you think Biden's Catholicism might affect the White House and how it operates, right? Since you've covered administrations in the past. So in other words, do you think this is going to affect his policies, his actions, his speeches in a sort of day-to-day way, and how that will play out in our public life?
I think we're already seeing it, and he is not shy about talking about how Catholic social doctrine has formed him, not just as a person, but also as a politician. And I think you see that in certainly his approach to climate change, in seeing that this is a danger that poses a danger for all of us, not the least it poses a danger for all of us, especially for the least among us who are most vulnerable, most at risk from climate change, because they don't have the ability to adapt and hold off the impacts of climate change. I think you see it in his immigration policy. Again, you see it in his quest for environmental justice and racial justice. All of that is part of it. But you know what I was really struck by in doing this piece that I did for the Today Show on Biden's faith was looking at what John F. Kennedy said in 1960 when he spoke to that convention of Baptist ministers at the Rice Hotel in Houston. And he said, "I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me." Fast forward 61 years, and that seems not to be enough anymore.
Well, that's a good way to go to you, Bishop McElroy, because I know that you've talked a lot about the engagement and the differences between where John Kennedy is and where Biden is. But let's back up a little bit. You're the Bishop of San Diego. You've studied and written about the intersection of Catholicism in American public life quite a bit. And you're seen as a leader among bishops close to Pope Francis. Your statement on Inauguration Day called for dialogue, not judgment, collaboration, not isolation, truth and charity, not harshness. And that's what you've talked about here today. I wonder if you could lay out the implications of that stance a little bit more. For instance, when we talk about the Hyde Amendment or when we talk about the Mexico City policy, how can the bishops engage with the administration when the president continues to take actions that will advance abortion in this country, how can we make that not just one among many issues while not having a confrontational stance?
I think by following the same pattern that the conference has throughout its history, which is engagement, dialogue, and criticism. And every administration, the conference has had tremendous sets of issues on which there's been great criticism. And there has also been great support and affirmation of policy directions from every administration. But it's always been within a context of engagement rather than that of opposition. I think that's one element. The second is, I think we should look at what is the mission of the Bishops' Conference in this whole question. We should go to the fundamental elements of that and really have a good synodal discussion within the Bishops' Conference of the White Church. What is our role now? Because things are flying apart in our society, and we need to have the role that the church should have and can have at its best. And thirdly, I would say that I think the most important issue for us to face at this moment is, how do we help heal our broken political culture? Because until we do that, we cannot find lasting, substantial gain in any issue area, because we won't be able to bring together enough people within our society that on the next change of administrations, it won't be reversed. And so we need to be a part of helping to forge that unity and that healing. That doesn't mean we're not going to vigorously advocate on behalf of legal protections for the unborn, or on behalf of the planet, or against racism. It doesn't mean that. But it means our most important mission, I think, at this present moment in the public order, is to help heal our nation and help recapture a sense of consensus within the society on certain important things. And thus, we have to signal unity on those same things ourselves.
I wonder, I might follow up on it with that. We're getting a number of questions in already, and many of them ask about our responsibilities as lay Catholics, the responsibilities of Catholic institutions in general, Catholic public officials. So we've talked about the responsibility of Catholic bishops, and you've talked about that. What are lay Catholics' responsibilities, or leaders of other Catholic institutions? How should they work to promote engagement on issues where we agree, disagree, and have some room for negotiation?
I'd say it's the same within the church that it is in society. That is, what are we seeking to have within our culture of public discourse? How do we engage on some things with people who disagree, even disagree fundamentally? And how do we seek to bridge those differences? If that's our aim for the tone and fundamental goal of conversation and dialogue within the country and within our society, then it's the same obligation for us in light of the gospel. As Catholics, for me as one of the members of the Bishops' Conference, for Catholic lay leaders, for Catholics as citizens and believers who vote, it's the same thing. How do we move toward that sort of dialogue and understand this fundamental truth? Political dialogue that looks to the other side is what Pope Francis says about engagement and encounter. It means understanding the other person on the other side has some important things to say, and beginning with that, and then being honest about the issues that we need to advocate for, but within that context.
Helen, let's go back to you now. You and I have been friends for a long time. You're a professor at George Mason University's Law School. You have roles at the Vatican, as we said, and at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And last week you wrote that the church is right not to let the abortion issue slide, even if there was an avalanche of good political news on the horizon for other parts of our social justice agenda. Everybody who knows you knows your deep commitment to all parts of that social justice agenda, and also your deep commitment to working to right the grave injustice of abortion. So what are the principles and priorities that should shape the interaction between the Biden White House and U.S. Catholic leaders in the Vatican? What are areas of tension and conflict? But also, should the administration's abortion agenda be a roadblock to working together on other issues?
So much, Kim. I try to be brief. First, there's the theological question. Is not just protecting, but even celebrating the intentional destruction of life at a defenseless moment. In fact, giving the legal right only to one member of the family to destroy another. Is that different from other things? The Catholic Church has always said yes. Pope Francis has said yes. John Paul II has said yes. We've said yes since the first century in the Didache. The Jesuits put out a remarkable document on the anniversary of Roe last week. They said it's different, it's key, it's different, it's a direct taking of life. If so, that has to be reacted to with special horror. If somebody was, and I know some people regard various administrations' reactions to immigrants as equivalent to this, as sort of hiring hit squads to kill them. If we thought of, and Pope Francis, I use that language because he referred to abortion with the language of hit squad, which surprised pro-lifers who don't use that language here in the States. But if we were hiring or celebrating one person's ability to take the life of another, I just have no doubt that the church would always say, this is especially horrid and we need to attend to this. I'm not familiar, perhaps Bishop McElroy, speaking to other bishops, with some group who is saying nothing else matters, or this is the only litmus test. We know that bishops have excommunicated folks for failure to integrate schools, et cetera. We know this is the case. But there is something different about it. The church has 2,000 years of theology. It can bring this to bear on what is a theological question. It's a canon law question as well, whether not just allowing it, but say President Biden's statement that, gee, if Roe is overturned, I'm going to make sure the states cannot protect human life because I'm going to codify it at the national level. I'm going to make sure you're not allowed to protect them. That's really amazing. So many other issues, maybe not all, but so many others are questions of differences of opinion as to how to support the common good, prudential matters. This is different. A couple of other things. One is, I think the word unity confuses people. I think accompaniment, dialogue doesn't confuse people. We're not going to have the same opinion on things, right? And we have to advocate forcefully. And we don't have to make everybody a jack of all trades and master of none. You know, I don't require anybody on this phone call to speak at crisis pregnancy centers. But they should say to me, right on, sister. And they should be so proud of those Catholic grassroots, you know, in whose apartments and in whose kids' bunk beds I slept for 10 years while traveling the country on behalf of the bishops. They should be so proud of them. They should say, right on, sisters. And then I say, right on to all of those who have made their brilliant and beautiful expertise opening up to a more generous immigration system, taking real steps to end structural racism. I think, frankly, and this is my last point in this, it's the idea that we're really going to have a movement in the Biden administration or in the party that he represents. You know, when I started in Pro-Life for the Bishops, I had 50 pro-life Democrats I could hang with on the Hill. They used to take pictures with me and send them home to the district. I mean, think about it. I had 50. And there was not, whether it was bishops, lay Catholics, all of the combined, a concerted effort to keep them with us on this issue, as well as all these others that we so agree with them on. You know, the sexual issues, sex is sort of the heart of human freedom, of sort of Freud, Marcuse, Reich sort of point of view, has weirdly gotten adopted as a political position right now. It's harmful. It has long-term consequences. Me Too, 40% out of wedlock birth rate, poverty. Women are suffering at huge rates for this. The Catholic Church is one of the few people that speaks about it in a sane and loving and intellectual way. We're going to have to keep doing that. So we're going to have differences in dialogue. We're going to do them the way we have done them, which I think is remarkably civil. I mean, looking at the language of Gomez's statements, it's beautiful, all the good wishes and grace and prayers that are expressed there. But I think we're not going to escape the differences and the argument. There's not going to be unity. There's going to be respectful dialogue. I think that's what we can really hope for.
Just to follow up on that, we're getting a lot of questions about why, and I think you're the one to outline this, about why other issues aren't preeminent in that same way. When the U.S. bishops talk about the preeminent issue of abortion, it's not that they're saying it's the only issue, it's that they're saying it's the preeminent one. And people are asking, why isn't the death penalty? Why isn't immigration or climate change? Why aren't those issues preeminent in the same way? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. So the death penalty, I think, certainly could be. You know, the theology on this at present is if there is a way in your country to avoid people who have committed a serious crime from hurting others, then there's no excuse for the death penalty. And you are deliberately killing folks in a situation where you ought not to. Great. If that's really the teaching, and we in the United States have the capacity to keep people incarcerated and not to harm others, then the death penalty's use is against our teaching on that and is a preeminent issue. If we have really come to the moral conclusion that a war that we are engaged in, and it doesn't matter by whom, you know, we are a very warlike country, and the peace movement is almost, I don't know where it is. It's just, you don't see it. Then that's a preeminent issue. Direct killing, innocent, and in particular in abortion, celebrating it as a woman's right is what makes it so special. But these other issues can be.
John, let's go to you now to wrap us up before we get to audience questions. You worked at the Bishops' Conference for decades. You worked through several administrations and multiple Congresses. Since then, you've built our initiative here at Georgetown into a leader in bringing Catholic social thought to public life and bridging political and ecclesial divides. In America, you explained why you opposed Trump and supported Biden in spite of President Biden's position on abortion. And in a recent interview, you said that the consistent ethic of life Catholics like yourself need to be consistent and make clear why we supported Joe Biden and why we did not, and to insist that there is no mandate for repeal of the Hyde Amendment. Can you talk a little bit more about why you think we can engage in some way with the administration? In fact, it's a moral imperative for us to be engaging on the very great variety of issues that we have in common.
Well, this conversation reminds me of the second floor of the Bishops' Conference, where Helen and I were at different ends of the hall, where we shared an awful lot in common, but sometimes had some different emphases. Your point about celebration, your point about the work that's been doing, one of the proudest things in my family is my mother started the Crisis Pregnancy Center in my hometown. I really missed the March for Life. To be honest, I never liked the rally. I really liked the march because it was so young and so alive, and this year we couldn't do it. Abortion is different. So is racism. That's a fundamental, and that's a big part of why I could not support Trump and why I ended up supporting Biden in spite of his position on embracing the extremism of his party. Separating children from their parents at the border is different and demands a response. Some advice for the bishops, for the Biden administration, and for the rest of us. For the bishops, make distinctions. There are things we can agree on. Let's fight for those priorities. It would be a great thing to get immigration reform. It'd be a great thing to end the federal death penalty, which is the United States taking the death of others. It would be a great thing to work together to overcome COVID. Secondly, there are areas of where we have to dialogue. I think we have to make the case to the administration that if they impose restrictions on federal funds for Christian ministries, it's not just the church that suffers, it's the poor that suffer. Who feeds the hungry? Who shelters the homeless? Who educates the young? So Black churches, Catholic parishes, Catholic schools do that. Thirdly, there are going to be areas which we disagree and we ought to be clear, but frankly, we should try to persuade others to join us, not just condemn. We need to spend a lot more time talking about the humanity of the unborn child than whether Joe Biden can go to communion. For the Biden administration, there is a fight for the soul of the country. There's a fight for the priorities of the administration. I don't see Joe Biden talking about celebrating the extreme position of his party. He seems quite uncomfortable with it. If they engage in their own culture war We're going to have to resist this in every way we can. But what are going to be the priorities? The reason why Catholics in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan supported Biden is not because he was going to repeal the Hyde Amendment, but he was going to lead with some empathy and try and heal the country, and they have to decide what are their priorities. Thirdly, for the rest of us, all of us have to be consistent. Catholic progressives need to fight for the Hyde Amendment. I think one of the things the bishops ought to do is be really specific about where we're going to put our energy. Immigration reform, climate, overcoming COVID, overcoming poverty, and saving Hyde. To require the rest of us to pay for other people's abortion, I think it can be done, but it won't be done as a partisan issue. And frankly, Catholic progressives, consistent ethnic Catholics, need to raise our voices. Also, it's time to hear from Republicans, Catholics, good friends of mine, that the embrace of Trumpism, the demonizing of immigrants, the use of racial issues to divide our country is not the future for their party. So I think there's a lot of work for us to do. My advice is the pastoral is the responsibility of Joe Biden's pastor and his bishops. I think denying communion, there's a reason why throughout history the church hasn't done this, why it's not done around the world, why almost no Catholic dioceses do this. Seems to me theologically inappropriate, ecclesially disastrous, and politically counterproductive. So the pastoral is not the responsibility of the rest of us. The partisan politics, not the responsibility of the conference. What is its responsibility is policy, and we ought to find ways to work together effectively where we can to advance the common good, to negotiate our differences where we can to advance the common good, and to resist policies which will undermine the common good.
I want to sort of step back a little bit now, and maybe, Anne, take this question to you. And we're starting on questions that are coming in from our audience. Thanks to all of you who are sending them. We have so many, and I'm going to do my best to group them together and get to a lot of them. But Anne, let's start with you first. And this is, again, stepping back. Why are internal Catholic disputes often more angry and divisive and polarizing than our engagement with just about everybody else? I mean, is that a good characterization of how you've seen Catholic engagement in public life, that these intra-Catholic discussions tend to be more divisive or not? And why is that? How can we deal with it?
I think certainly in my professional lifetime, Kim, it is the discussion over abortion and contraception and now same-sex marriage that has become so fraught and so angry that it seems to there is people aren't looking for common ground. They just seem to be yelling at each other all the time. That may make for a good TV story. It may make for a good newspaper story. I'm not sure that it's doing us a whole lot of good as a faith, quite honestly, and that's speaking as just the Catholic in the pew, because it tends to blot out everything else. I mean, I will give you an example that's near and dear to my heart because I'm a graduate of the University of Notre Dame. When Notre Dame invited President Obama to come speak at its commencement, as Notre Dame has done since Dwight Eisenhower, always invited the president in the first year of his presidency to come deliver the commencement address. It was done in part because of that tradition, but also because our President Emeritus, Father Theodore Hesburgh, had devoted his life to civil rights. And Barack Obama, being elected as the first African-American president of the United States, was, if you will, that vision come to life. That got completely obliterated. No one covered it in the run-up to President Obama's speech because it was all focused on his support for abortion. And so then when President Obama comes to Notre Dame and speaks, people are surprised. It's like, well, why isn't there were protests, but there was no great protest because there was something more in that. And I think that's what's happened in the church, and certainly the public perception of the church, I think to a great degree, is that we are angry and we fight over this, and all we do is yell at each other, and we're not making progress. How do you make that progress? You make that progress, I think, by accompanying, by listening, by dialogue, because the goal that people want to get to is not having any abortions. That's what I hear from both sides. So how do you get beyond the yelling? And I think that's the challenge for the Catholic Church today.
Thanks for that, Anne. And I think this next question, first to you, Bishop McElroy, and if others of you want to weigh in, just let me know. We're getting a lot of questions about communion. Archbishop Gomez, the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, has told bishops that the working group on President Biden will offer a statement on Eucharistic coherence, revisiting the question of whether Catholic public officials should be denied communion because of their public commitments or actions on abortion. Do you think this is a good idea? Do you think this will help advance pro-life witness in this country or not?
No, I don't think it's a good idea. The conference has no pastoral relationship with President Biden. The only two bishops in the United States who have a pastoral relationship in the eyes of the church with and a responsibility with President Biden are Cardinal Gregory of Washington and Bishop Malooly of Wilmington. They have a pastoral responsibility for him. And the traditional church is very clear on these communion questions. It falls to that bishop to determine this. The conference has no role in this, no right role in this. In addition, I do not see how depriving the president or other political leaders of the Eucharist based on their public policy stance can be interpreted in our society as anything other than a weaponization of the Eucharist and an effort not to convince people by argument and by dialogue and reason, but rather to pummel them into submission on the issue. And so I think it'd be very destructive. It would also cast the conference more significantly into the role of being partisan, as being associated with one party rather than the other. And for all those reasons, I think in all of these questions, what should we do? My mother used to say to me the question I used to hate when I was just thinking what to do. And she said to me, what would Jesus do? I think on this question, we should ask, what would Jesus do in this case? But also on abortion, we should ask, what would Jesus do? And he'd say, you need to fight for the unborn children. On the immigration, you need to fight for the children on the border and the refugees. On race, you need to fight for those who are perennially evicted. So if we just ask that question, try to come together in that way, what would Jesus do? I think that would be a way of bringing us closer to the reality we should be pursuing as a church.
Thanks for that. And Helen, I'm going to turn to you now. I wonder if you want to speak to that question, but I also have many questions coming in from folks who say that some data shows that under Democratic administrations, abortion rates seem to have gone down, that the Biden administration is likely to put in place policies that will create a stronger social safety net for young women facing unplanned pregnancies. So how should we factor that into our witness on pro-life issues?
Yeah, you hear that. And so I took a look at the data because that's a common charge. There's a Planned Parenthood has hired someone to troll my internet accounts. And she comes in with this, no matter where I speak on this claim. Abortion rates have gone up and down, not much, mostly down since the 90s, through Clinton, through Bush, through Obama, through Trump. And there's a whole range of factors. They've gone from about 1.67 at the end of the 80s. Now we have about 900,000 a year, which is still a lot. We are very high. Oddly, the women who are given $2 to $3 billion a year of federal and state contraception money are the women with the very highest rates of unintended pregnancy, the highest rates of abortion, the highest rates of out-of-wedlock pregnancy. it is a very complicated picture. I've written an article that'll be published soon called Abortion and Democracy, in which I'm looking at the arguments being made to the effect of, what could we do democratically, given that the Supreme Court invented an abortion right and took it away from the democracy? What could we do? And part of the answer is economic measures, educational measures. Part of it is support for the family. It's both cultural and economic. And anyone who says it's not is really being partisan and not being scientific about it. It is not the case that you see them go down under Democrats and up under Republicans, et cetera. That's a trope that's out there. In fact, you've got fewer high school kids having sex by a large amount since the 90s. You've got more people who are marrying and not getting divorced. Well, I should say fewer are getting married overall, but those who are getting married are not getting divorced. Planned Parenthood claims that you got more people using certain kinds of contraception. The answer has nothing to do with a Republican or Democrat. It's so much deeper than that. We do know, however, and this is the final thing I'll say on it, that if you fund abortion, which Biden has pledged to do, you get more of it. We do know that. So unlike every Republican and Democrat before him, with the Hyde Amendment, who at least helped keep a lid in that regard by not promoting abortion, by funding it. If he reverses that, that is a carte blanche to increase the abortion rate.
Thanks for that, Helen. And John, I wonder if I might go to you with this question. And we have this coming in from a couple people. The U.S. bishops have been largely silent, this questionnaire asks, about the insurrection, about the attack on the Capitol. And we are talking about all of this in some sense as if it's in a vacuum. But in fact, of course, we're at a time when our prior president, President Trump, was in many ways advanced pro-life policies, and many bishops said we should be supporting him. And at the same time, this administration has ended up in a position where our Capitol was under attack. How do you put it in that context, how we should engage with the new administration, given our experience with the old administration, particularly culminating in the attack on the Capitol?
Wow. Raising teenagers, I used to say it's important you tell the truth all the time. It's especially important you tell the truth when you're in big trouble. We're in big trouble. So our country, our leaders, our bishops, the rest of us ought to tell the truth. President Biden won the election, and he's the president of the United States. He is a Catholic. He does support a lot of things that the church supports. He says he's formed by Catholic social teaching, and he's pledged to take positions that go against parts of our teaching. I think being straightforward about all of that. People say they're afraid that Biden will confuse people. I think the one thing people know about the Catholic Church in America, Helen is part of this in a good way, is that we oppose the destruction of unborn human life. I don't think there's much confusion about that. The problem is we have to persuade more of us to share that view and to act on it. And not just the President of the United States, a lot of Catholics. And the idea that we would use communion or other sanctions, I think it turns them into sort of victims of ecclesiastical pressure. And even worse, those who stand with us are seen as, have to explain it's their moral convictions instead of the concern about discipline. The other thing as a parent of teenagers, I do not want anyone to create a situation where, you try and keep your kids close to the church your whole life. You try and get them to Mass and communion. And they say, if President Biden can't go to communion because he's pro-choice, I can't go to communion because I'm not going to church. This is not where we want to draw this line. We need to find a way, and this will be my last point on this. We need to embrace the leadership of Pope Francis without apology, unequivocally. He is our leader. I don't think there's a better way to talk about this to President Biden, to the bishops, to the rest of the country than his metaphor of the throwaway society. We do throw away the unborn. We do throw away immigrants. We are tempted to throw away the elderly. COVID is a lot about who gets thrown away and who doesn't. We may throw away God's creation. And if there's confusion, one of the things we ought to help people understand is Pope Francis, his mission, his message is the church's message. And we ought to be clear about that and frankly take on those who try and undermine that.
Thanks for that, John. Anne, I want to, again, broaden the question out a little bit and go to you on this one. Someone asked, right, who we all agree as Catholics, people, we know that that abortion is a grave injustice. And the first part of the question is, who will have more impact on the Biden administration's policies on abortion, the U.S. bishops or Pope Francis, in terms of their approach? And secondly, how do everyday Catholics see what's happening here? Like, what should we do when we see a conflict between different approaches to engagement with the administration?
It's probably hard for me to answer the second question. The first question's a whole lot easier, Kim. I think that just in the last week, I think there's no question that Pope Francis' approach will have a lot more weight than the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And I think, as Bishop McElroy has pointed out, the person in the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops who really can influence, has great opportunity to influence what President Biden thinks and perhaps how the Biden administration acts, is Cardinal Gregory. And Cardinal Gregory has made it clear that he is not going to keep President Biden from receiving communion. And as he says, he doesn't want to bring a gun to the table. He sees an opportunity for dialogue here, at least from what I have read and what I understand of his thinking, on many different issues. And perhaps that the abortion is one. You know, I keep thinking back to a question I asked Pope Francis on the papal plane about communion for divorced and remarried Catholics. And his point was communion is not the beginning of the discussion, but the end. There is a journey to that point. And I've been thinking, is that not the same thing about abortion? Is there not a journey to some kind of consensus improvement here? Then that journey can only happen if the two sides agree to talk together, to have, and there is some kind of accompaniment, which the Pope talks about a lot.
Thanks for that, Anne. As we wrap up here, I just want to ask one question of all of you. And just a closing comment, perhaps, and I'll start with you, Bishop McElroy, drawing from Pope Francis' recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti, where he called for a better kind of politics, a renewal of politics through social and political charity. So many of those watching today live out their Catholic faith every day in ways large and small, and they're far removed from national politics. How can each of us contribute to a better kind of politics in this challenging moment? Bishop McElroy?
One of the key concepts that Pope Francis talks about in Fratelli Tutti is that notion of social friendship. And I think that needs to be brought back into the core of our political dialogues. You know, there was that poll, and you've all seen it one form or another. I think it was in Atlantic, and it asked in the 60s, what percentage of Americans would be very upset if their child married someone of another political party? And in the 60s, it was about 5%. Now it's about 40%. And it shows the chasm that party structure has become worldview. It's a shorthand for worldview. And we live in isolated worldviews now. Fratelli Tutti says we can't be isolated in our silos of worldviews. We need to dialogue together. And so social friendship, I think, is the main thing we need to aim at, because we won't become a society which can comprehensively or effectively pursue the common good unless we have that. That has to be brought back, not perfectly, but at least as a more vibrant part of our social and political life.
Thank you, Bishop McElroy. John, how about you? How do you think we can get to this better kind of politics, into a social friendship, and will that help us advance Catholic social principles?
In some ways, I'm speaking to myself here. We need to get out of our bunkers and our bubbles. We shouldn't just talk to people who agree with us. That's sort of our story as co-directors at the initiative. We come from different places. Who you follow, who you listen to, who you talk to is really important. We ought to worry more about persuading people than judging people. Mark Shields has this great line. He says, you can tell the health of an organization by whether you're looking for converts or trying to find heretics. This is a time for converts. It's a time for converts in a divided country. It's a time for converts in a divided church. And my experience, I bet Helen shares this, when I was on the Hill, it was not what we said that mattered. It was what we did, who we followed. So tonight, we're going to shelter the homeless. We're going to feed the hungry. We're going to take care of the sick. We're helping women who face a pregnancy alone. Let's follow Pope Francis' advice. Let's encounter the least of these. And let's take that message into the public square in a way that creates converts rather than pursues heretics.
Helen, how about you? How can we answer Pope Francis' call for a better kind of politics? How can we answer his call for social friendship, particularly those of us just lay Catholics? How can we do that in our everyday lives?
I like John's use of the language of converts, both in Amoris Laetitia and in Fratelli Tutti. The Pope really wants us to be positive. He really wants us to be looking for opportunities. It is a thrust of his papacy that's huge. That leads me to a couple of things. Number one, we don't blame either side when they're working with an administration that will give them something that the church agrees with. Pro-lifers didn't ask to work only with the Republican Party. The Republican Party came to them and the Democrats sadly walked away. So they work with the Republicans and they'd love to work with Democrats. They would rejoice, like I did in the 80s, to have their pictures taken with Democratic elected officials if we could find more of those. Second and final is, and I say this a lot in our religious freedom context, but it works overall in any political context. Don't just state our rules, give our reasons. I have had conversations, one with my accountant who asked, I could see face to face with you on the abortion thing. At least I get why you people feel this way. I do not understand the talks you're giving on contraception. And I said, well, give me 5 minutes to talk about the importance of sex related to tomorrow, related to love, kin, family. And you'll see that though we don't attempt to make law banning contraception, why we at least want to be a light on the subject. So not rules, reasons. And don't blame social services for seeking money and assistance from the Biden administration or the pro-life for seeking good rules from a Trump or a Bush or a future Republican administration. Blame people if they don't argue that the consistent ethic should be instantiated in both parties, but not for being masters of particular political issues.
Thanks, Helen. And let's close it out with you. You've covered the release of a number of different encyclicals. I feel like Fratelli Tutti was so special because it's in this time of COVID and Pope Francis is really reacting and building on his various statements and catechesis leading up to it. How can we work together for a better politics from where you sit in the media, from those of us in the pews? How can we build that kind of social friendship?
I think it comes down to one word, Kim, and that is listen. We cannot go forward if we don't listen to each other. And we can't go forward if we don't engage with each other. Our democracy does not work if it is a zero-sum game where one side completely obliterates the other. We have to listen. We have to be willing to find common ground. And only in that way can we begin to bring about unity.
Thanks so much. That's a great way to end it, Anne. And thanks to all of you, Bishop McElroy, Anne, Helen, and John. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Just a reminder that this discussion will be recorded and posted on our website and social media channels for later viewing as well. And we'll have a follow-up resources from the discussion posted there too. I also want to preview some coming attractions. This Thursday, February 4th, we'll have a public dialogue on Black women and criminal injustice, missing voices in the U.S. incarceration conversation, co-sponsored by Georgetown's Prison and Justice Initiative and Georgetown's Women's Center. And this public dialogue will bring together 5 women who will discuss how race, gender, and politics impact Black women's experience in the U.S. criminal justice system. Later in February, we'll have a major public dialogue in our series on faith and the faithful in U.S. politics, on poverty and dignity, priorities in the election, and beyond. I want to thank all of those who helped us on the technical end of this dialogue, and a special thanks to my colleagues Anna Misla and our student fellows Herman and Sammy for helping make this dialogue go so smoothly. And finally, please join me in thanking our panel, Helen Alvarez, John Carr, Ann Thompson, and Bishop McElroy for their outstanding contribution to this conversation. Thank you so much, and all best.